Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. My name is Joe Davich. I'm the director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. And on behalf of the Georgia Center for the Book, we would like to welcome you to the 2022 presentation of the Lillian Smith Book Awards. Before we begin this evening's presentation, I would like to just mention a few housekeeping notes. If you'd like to ask a question to either one of our guests this evening after the formal presentation has concluded, please do so by using the Q&A feature. You can find the Q&A button at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on your advice. Please click on that and then type your questions in and we will answer them in turn. Also, we've enabled the closed captioning feature for our hearing impaired guests. You can find the CC button at the top or bottom of your screen. And if you click on that, you can adjust the font size to meet your needs. I'd also like to thank our many sponsors of the Lillian Smith Book Awards: the Southern Regional Council, the University of Georgia Libraries, Hargret Rare Manuscript and Book Library, DeKalb County Public Library, and Piedmont College, who all joined together along with the judges to select the two winning works we are featuring this evening. Works that, like Lillian Smith's work most of her life, demand equality, seek justice, and foster understanding. Each of our winners this evening received a hand-blown glass trophy created by Nate Nardi of Decatur Glass Blowing that features the Lillian Smith book logo designed by Jerry Wilson. Right now, I would like to turn our program over to Charles Johnson, chair of the Lillian Smith Book Awards, to tell you a little bit about the award history and Lillian Smith. Charles?
Good evening. I'm Charles Johnson, president of the Southern Regional Council. And on behalf of the council and its partners, I want to welcome you to this 54th annual and third ever virtual presentation of the Lillian Smith Book Awards. Let me begin by providing a little context. In the years just after the Second World War, when others were charting a cautious course on racial change and calling for a more humane treatment within a segregated system, it was Lillian Smith who, nearly alone among her colleagues, boldly and persistently articulated an entirely different vision of a completely desegregated South. And following her death in 1966, the Southern Regional Council established an award in her name to recognize authors whose work carries on the tradition of Lillian Smith, work of outstanding literary merit and high moral vision, which honestly portrays the South, its people, its problems, and its promise. For the last several years, this award has been presented as a partnership between the Southern Regional Council, which established the award, the University of Georgia Libraries, which house the Lillian Smith papers, the Georgia Center for the Book, which presents the Decatur Book Festival, and Piedmont College, which operates the Lillian Smith Center in Clayton, Georgia. Now, there are many people who have a hand in bringing this event to you every year, but I want to bring special acknowledgement and recognition to our heroic and distinguished panel of jurors who worked their way through the 59 books. And say it again, the 59 books that were nominated this year. They are from the University of Delaware, Minion C.K. Morrison; from Tennessee State University, Melvin Johnson; from the Board of Regents of the University System of Georgia, Merrill Pinson; from the Atlanta Fulton Public Library, James Taylor; and our chair from Clark Atlanta University, Mary Twining Baird. Won't you please join me in thanking our jurors for their heroic service? Now, this year's award recipients are very much in the tradition of our previous honorees. Maya Bay is the Roy F. and Jeanette P. Nichols Chair in American History at the University of Pennsylvania, where she studies American and African-American intellectual and cultural history. In her book, Traveling Black, A Story of Race and Resistance, she goes back to the sources with some basic questions. How did travel segregation begin? How did it move from one form of transportation to another? And what was it like to be caught up in its web of contradictory rules? In addressing these questions, Traveling Black upends our understanding of Black resistance, documenting a sustained fight that falls outside the traditional boundaries of the civil rights movement as traditionally defined and explains why the long, unfinished journey to racial equality so often takes place on the road. Jocelyn Nicole Johnson is a veteran public school art teacher. Her writing has appeared in Guernica, The Guardian, and elsewhere. Her book, My Monticello, tells of a diverse group of Charlottesville neighbors fleeing violent white supremacists. Her characters seek out home as a place and an internal state, and united by the relentless struggles of these characters against reality and against fate, My Monticello bears witness to this country's legacies and announces the arrival of a wildly original new voice in American fiction. So you've heard enough from me. Let's hear from our honorees. Without further ado, I present to you Maya Bay, recipient of a 2022 Lillian Smith Book Award for her book, Traveling Black, A Story of Race and Resistance.
Thank you. I want to start out by thanking the jurors and the many sponsoring organizations. This award is an honor. Lillian Smith is someone I've long admired. The principles that she supported, as well as her writing, are something that I've admired for a long time. So it's a great honor. What I want to do over the next 15-20 minutes is just kind of give you a brief overview of my book. And I'm going to show you some pictures because part of what I found about studying the history of traveling Black, the history of how Blacks negotiated various forms of transportation, is that a lot of it is sort of technology that some of you may remember, but others of you may not. And it presented all kinds of spectacles that I really had to dig down and see with my own eyes. So I will start there. So just quickly, Traveling Black explores the intertwined history of travel segregation and Black struggles for freedom of movement, which I found to be really central in African-American history. It's organized around the successive forms of transportation adopted by Americans, and it follows the experiences of successive generations of African-American travelers as they encounter and resist segregation on everything from stagecoaches and steamships to trains, planes, and automobiles. And one of the many things that fascinated me in trying to kind of reconstruct this experience was just the ways in which African Americans were confronted with new technology, and the ways in which segregation, which we sometimes think as just a sort of ironclad set of rules, was something that had to be adapted to changing technology, and changing social conditions. So my book studies how all of this happens, and as well as how African Americans work systematically to eradicate it. So just a few pictures to get a sense of what I'm talking about. Trains were at the sort of heart of this battle. Trains, um, discrimination on trains, separate but equal facilities on trains, were what was adjudicated in Plessy versus Ferguson, the famous case that established separate but equal. People sometimes forget it's a railroad case, but what it did was sort of write in stone conditions that had already emerged within the kind of struggles over white supremacy in the late 19th century South, in which Blacks invariably had worse conditions. So up at the top of the picture, you see a Jim Crow car, which was an old wooden car. Sometimes it was also the luggage car and the smoking car. And below you see two different compartments from a 1937 legal case, where the white passengers in the white car are sitting in big sort of plush seats in an air-conditioned compartment, and the Black passengers are sitting in what's obviously a much older compartment, less clean, less comfortable. And that is sort of in a nutshell what it was, though it could sometimes be much worse than that. Sometimes Jim Crow cars didn't have heat. Sometimes they were lit with fire burning stoves, while white cars had been upgraded to use electric heat to make them less dangerous. And over time, the Jim Crow cars, which tended to be made out of wood rather than metal, because they were older cars, became increasingly dangerous because they were often the only old car on the train. So the Jim Crow car became a sort of grievance that almost symbolized Black second-class citizenship during the early years of the 20th century, and Blacks fought riding in the Jim Crow car, fought the laws that relegated them into it, never quite succeeding. And at the same time, people also were very eager to find other options. The railroad was, for a time, the sort of major way to travel anywhere quickly. But starting in the early 20th century, you begin to get um, other options, most notably the car, which is something that Blacks who can afford to own cars adopt early. One example is the man portrayed here, the boxer Jack Johnson, who was the world's heavyweight champion in 1908. He loved to drive, and at one point owned as many as 8 cars. He was a man of generally swaggering self-confidence whose challenge to white whose mastery of boxing was a challenge to white masculinity. And so too was his mastery of cars. His driving drew all kinds of hostility many places he went. He was often stopped by the police. He received tickets for speeding, reckless driving, obstructing traffic, and other moving violations, which did not discourage him from driving. He once told a Chicago judge that all of his law breaking was simply done for advertising purposes. But it did illustrate one of the challenges that Blacks would face in driving. They would not always be welcome as drivers, and this would grow worse over time. Blacks bought cars, as I said, when they could, and this included not just celebrities like Jack Johnson, but also ordinary people like the sharecroppers who used their cotton picking money on cars, who are pictured here in a sort of Depression era photograph. And Blacks also did their best to make their way onto buses, which developed alongside cars. But all of them would prove somewhat unsatisfactory because with both cars and buses, what you also had developing was a system of roadside accommodations, from restaurants to hotels, motels, gas stations, all of which catered mainly to white people. We think of traveling by car, for instance, as private, but it really involves entering a system of automobility where we're dependent on things that sort of make our cars useful to us. And this would become a major problem for Black travelers fairly early on. Um, Early bus lines sometimes refused to carry African American passengers, both because they regarded them as not desirable passengers, but also sometimes quite simply because they knew that the rest stops, there was no place that they would not Blacks would not be permitted to go to the bathroom, would not be permitted to eat. And this could be a problem not just in the South, but in the North as well sometimes, which made matters worse. One of the things that really puzzled me in researching this book was the extent of retail segregation against Black drivers. I found evidence even, for instance, of gas stations that would not serve Black drivers. They wouldn't sell them gas. I really spent a long time figuring out why this was, and eventually realized that it was at least partially because um, the sort of network of services that developed around the car, especially things like gas stations, were developed to cater to an increasingly large audience of drivers. And there was a special emphasis on appealing to women, white women, who were seen as a great market. So that's one of the reasons why we have gas stations. Gas was originally sold in hardware stores, but Um, they sought to oil companies sought to make the experience more seamless and friendly by developing these kind of homey gas stations. If you look at this picture, you'll see it. The gas station looks sort of like a cottage. This is a model that you can even see today. And this was a goal to appeal to female consumers. Unfortunately, especially in the South, in appealing to white women, many gas station owners kind of saw that certain other people were unwelcome at their gas stations. And this was what led to the blocking of Black passengers in some gas stations in the South and a few in the North. So all of this meant that even with the development of a possibly slightly better form of transportation, things were still often closed off to African Americans. Um, you see that in some of these guides that you guys may have heard of in recent years, such as the Green Book. These guides were really designed to allow Black drivers to negotiate this often unfriendly retail atmosphere. They had specific information about where you could stay, where you could eat, where you could get your car serviced. And many people testified that they were really sort of crucial to traveling successfully. But I also found that some drivers who used them ended up being dissatisfied. They were not always up to date. They did not really save people from all the potential dangers. Their ads were in part advertising, and you couldn't entirely rely on them or entirely make good choices from them. So they didn't entirely eliminate what over time grew to be the worst of what Black drivers faced, which was kind of uncertainty about where they could stop and stay, how they would be treated in particular places. And Blacks instead often kind of relied on a kind of more informal network, talking to people who had traveled places and otherwise hope for the best. The best was not always what they got, and the book tells a lot of stories of sort of journeys went awry. And unfortunately, this could happen in the air as well. This image is a sort of early imagining of how Jim Crow might move itself to the air. It comes out at a time before anything like commercial flight. But it kind of shows you how the segregation of transportation has sort of firmly fixed itself in the imagination of Americans and also people abroad. I think Puck is a British publication. Um, and this intrigued me, and so did the whole subject of flying while Black, since I hadn't read anything about it. And wasn't quite sure I could write about it. But when I did research, I did find that there was, in fact, a variety of forms of segregation and discrimination people experienced in the air. I think I'm getting ahead of myself. People would, people were initially Black who wanted to fly were initially sometimes blocked from flying. Subsequently, by the 1940s, a segregated seating system evolved in which Black passengers were often relegated to particular seats. And while that was challenged in the courts in the early 50s, Black passengers also encountered all kinds of forms of segregation on the ground. Ella Fitzgerald, for instance, was bumped off a plane in Hawaii. Blacks were often the first in line for kind of disruptions while flying. And while it might seem enjoyable to be stuck in Honolulu, she actually missed her concert in Australia and ended up suing and winning after this experience. For most Black passengers, these kind of disruptions were not something that they sued over, and they were also could be terribly inconvenient because there were many airports that did not have any restaurant facilities for Black passengers, especially in the South. So people who got stuck in the airport could be very, very uncomfortable. They also had things like colored restrooms, which you can kind of see. It's a little bit dim in the the right corner of that, right in front of the car rental signs, you see the colored restroom signs. All of these things would last right until the early 60s, when the Freedom Rides of 1961 put pressure on the Kennedy administration to finally put an end to segregation on buses, and trains and in airports. And the Kennedy administration took it up in a very serious way with the airports, many of which were federally funded. At that time, you also had freedom flights, which many people are unfamiliar with, but this is one from a group of ministers who were returning from the Freedom Rides and decided to challenge segregation within the airport at Tallahassee. So all of this, the book documents how this all comes to an end and the struggles required to end it, which were not just in the courts, but also often on the ground. There was sort of a sustained battle against segregation on transportation that basically lasted as long as those forms of transportation exist. I end by asking people to really think about the ways in which segregation and discrimination on transportation is really entirely gone. We live now in a much more car-centric society than those previous generations that fought segregation on buses and trains. And as a result, we still have considerable inequities around transportation. And they have to do with exactly how driving and roads are shaped in our country. Blacks tend to experience discrimination at almost every level of car buying and car ownership. Blacks and Hispanics are most numerous among people who don't own cars in the United States and experience negative consequences of that, especially in circumstances like the natural disaster that took place in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. There was no real provision made for people who didn't have cars, and as a result, most of the people left behind in New Orleans were Black. And then, of course, we have the sort of constant shame of our day, things like police stops, which again tend to target some people more than others. So I would just close by emphasizing that transportation remains a real site of inequities in our society. It's a sometimes invisible thing, especially for those who don't experience those difficulties, but it's something to think about as you move around the world. Thank you very much.
Our thanks to Maya Bay, and again, congratulations. It's now my pleasure to present to you Jocelyn Nicole Johnson, recipient of the 2022 Lillian Smith Book Award for her book, My Monticello.
Hi, everybody. That was fascinating, Mia. That was really interesting. And I hadn't thought about airplanes in particular and just all the little steps that it takes to get us somewhere and all the care and work that people have done to do that. So really, really fascinating. And I love the pictures. I'd like to just start by thanking the judges of the Lillian Smith Books Award also for highlighting My Monticello, and also the Southern Regional Council, the University of Georgia Libraries, DeKalb County Public Library, love the libraries, the Georgia Center for the Book, and Piedmont College, and anyone else who made this award, who makes this award possible every year. It's really an honor to be recognized for writing about the American South, especially in a way that carries on Lillian Smith's legacy. And by that, I mean shining a light on racial and social inequity and proposing a vision of justice. Smith's example is needed as much today as ever. And what I mean by that is it highlights that all of us, whatever our identities, should and must advocate for social justice, racial equity, and revolutionary environmental reform. So all the stories in my debut collection are set in Virginia, and they center Brown and Black people who are thinking about home and longing and belonging. And since this is a work of fiction, I'm going to read a a short bit from the inaugural story in this collection. This is a collection of short stories, and the first story is called Control Negro, and it's my dad's favorite. This is a story of a Black professor named Cornelius Adams, and I say that he's a Frankenstein-like father because he's running a secret social experiment on his only son in order to test America's promise. He wants to see if, given the right conditions, if his son is smart enough, decent enough, composed enough, will his son not only be spared racist violence, but will he also have access to life and to liberty? So I'm going to read just a page or two from Control Negro towards the middle. This story takes the form of a letter, so father writing to son. Everyone has an origin story, and this is yours. You began as a thought fully formed and sprung from my head. No, you were more like a determined line of questions, marching all together toward a momentous thrashing. It was 1985, years before you were born, and I'd just come to work here on this campus. Mother died at the start of fall semester, her body inundated with cancer, undiagnosed until she had passed. Numb, I traveled south to bury her, missing the initiation of my own first classes, returning as promptly as I could. I was only away for a week and a day, but a cold snap had scattered leaves onto the great lawn. My first afternoon back, I walked over to my office and was straightening the objects of my desk, my shirt sleeves rolled up, my back to the door. A man walked in and he startled when I turned to face him, so I startled too. He was, I learned a few minutes later, a senior colleague from my own department, history. He'd been away on sabbatical and come to my office to welcome me. Sorry, he said, I'm looking for Professor Adams. Do you know where I can find him, buddy? I realized what was happening a moment before he did and forced myself to laugh, to try to put him at ease, though I fear my laughter came out a strangled sound. You see, he'd mistaken me for one of the evening janitors. But then, the next week, I stood before all my bright young students. For the first time in a long time, I felt, if not settled, then at least situated. Soon after, in a morning seminar, I remember feeling hopeful as I collected an early set of in-class writings. Our topic, 19th century thinkers. I discovered a hand-drawn cartoon among the shuffle, no name in the corner. Passed in on purpose or by accident, it was hard to tell which. It was nothing really, just a single frame of itchy graphite titled Irony. Within its borders, a history professor leaned over a lectern, looking quite like me, same jacket and bow tie, except with something primitive about his face. A thought bubble hovered over the room of students. Darwin taught to men by an ape. It's nothing, I told myself as I walked back to my apartment that evening, though in truth I felt tired. What does it matter, I remember thinking. What does it matter how much I achieve, or how clearly I speak, or how carefully I conduct myself, if the brutal misjudgments remain regardless? What if even here, they cannot bring themselves to see me and instead see something oblique reflected where I thought I stood? Mother used to tell me, work hard, Cornelius, work twice as hard and you can have something. But there I was, a grown man, wondering what it was I could have and what would be forever withheld. What I needed, it occurred to me then, was to watch another man's life unfold. A Black boy, not unlike me, but better than me, an African American who was otherwise equivalent to those broods of average American Caucasian males who scudded through my classrooms. ACMs, I came to call them, and I wondered how they would measure up with this flawless young man as a watermark. No, it wasn't them exactly. I wanted to test my own beloved country. Given the right conditions, could America extend her promise of life and liberty to me too, to someone like me? What I needed was a control Negro. And given what I teach, it wasn't lost on me, the agitation of those two words linked together, that archaic descriptor clanking off the end like a rusted shackle. Those words struck in me, and from them you grew. So I'm going to talk a little bit more and then I'll end with one more reading. I heard somewhere that this collection, My Monticello, is the first fiction selection to win the Lillian Smith Award in some time, which is, again, a huge honor. To my mind, fiction can play a really important part in shaping the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, what we mean to one another, and about our responsibility to our ailing home planet. Some fiction lets us ponder the realities of the past so that we, as readers, can feel the past in our own bodies. Some fiction can expand our view and offer possibilities of the future. I was thinking about both the past and the future when I wrote the titular novella, My Monticello, which takes up the biggest part of this collection. I started to write the novella about 1 year after the Unite the Right March, which took place in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I live. And this was years before the January 6th storming of the Capitol. This was back in 2017. The Unite the Right rally was ostensibly a protest against our town's decision to remove a Confederate statue. But as many of you may remember, on August 11th and 12th of 2017, these Unite the Right protesters poured into our relatively small town carrying torches that were reminiscent of a fearsome time of violence towards Black people in this country, carrying banners with swastikas on them and machine guns. On Friday night, a group of protesters circled the Thomas Jefferson statue on the University of Virginia and fought with students who opposed them there. On Saturday morning, they spilled onto our downtown pedestrian mall, passing shops and restaurants that I knew well, chanting, "Jews will not replace us," and "into the ovens." Counter-protesters showed up too, people who opposed Unite the Right's message of genocide and white supremacy. Some people in the two opposing groups bloodied and pepper sprayed one another, while police stood stone-faced, seeming only to guard storefronts. As you may know, one man violently sped his car into a group of counter-protesters, killing one young woman, Heather Heyer, and battering many others. In the days and weeks that followed this protest, I couldn't help but ask myself, what does it mean that this just happened here in Charlottesville, here in Virginia, and how should I, as a Black woman, as a mother, as my nerdy, arty art teacher self, how should I respond? I responded in part by writing the novella, My Monticello. In the novella, I wrote the novella in part as a cautionary tale. In it, I tried to imagine what the future might look like if the kind of anger and entitlement we saw in Charlottesville went unchecked. My Monticello is a story of social and environmental unraveling. In it, a band of men with torches and guns attack a mostly Black, mostly low-income neighborhood, forcing neighbors to flee. One group takes refuge just outside of town at Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's pristine plantation home turned tourist site, led by Denasia Love, a local and UVA student. Nasia and her grandmother are imagined Black descendants of Thomas Jefferson and an enslaved woman, Sally Hemings, with whom Jefferson had 6 children. While taking refuge at Monticello, Denasia is forced to confront the troubled past. And in the story, I tried to explore some of the harm of racism and racial hate, but also imagine responses to it. For Nasia and her neighbors, there are no easy answers. Still, they oppose the men who set fire to their homes by binding themselves to one another in community. One hope I have in sharing this book is to invite us to think about the past and present in relation to the future. I've come strongly to believe that even massive systems of harm, like racism, are made up of a million small gestures that get codified into law and culture. And that part of defeating these same systems of harm will be in our gestures, the way we carry those values of equity and justice, not just on a banner, not only on a banner at a protest, but also into our day-to-day choices. In this way, you make my future and I make yours, and for good or for ill. And together we are right now making the future. I'm going to end with another reading from the beginning of the novella, My Monticello, and thanks in advance for listening. I hope you enjoy it and check out these stories. My Monticello. We claimed it first, this little mountain, me and Ma Violet and a scattering of neighbors, all of us fleeing First Street after men came to set our row of 10 roofed homes on fire. The men came at dusk, blaring an operatic, "Oh, say, can you see?" White heads rose up from dusty jeeps, and dark hair thrashed in a harsh new wind like tattered flags. "Ours," the men shouted. Their rifles gleamed as if they'd only just been bought, a megastore militia. Through a hasty breach in my Violet's blinds, I even saw a boy among them, blonde and sneering in a pickup window. Men leapt from back seats, sprang out of truck beds and rushed towards the faces of our homes. White hands clutched metal canisters, swung torches, spilling flames. Bright shouts, the rising haze of smoke, all that and more rousted us out. From our patchy front yards, we saw bodies blur as some of our neighbors charged forward to try to stop them. We saw a teen struck with the butt of a rifle, his temple spraying red. A toddler flailed, diapered and clinging to its mother's hip as she sank knees first to the sidewalk. What we saw in those moments riveted us, and then it set us free. No plan of where to go until my eyes landed on the short jaunt bus parked along First, cloaked in its skin of stars and stripes. Ma Violet used to ride those small city buses, which cater to seniors and folks with disabilities. This particular jaunt had sat out front for weeks, abandoned like so many vehicles ever since the grid went down. A break in the roaring line of jeeps, and Knox and I ran toward it, tugging Ma Violet between us, still in her pale housecoat and slippers. Behind us, I saw Devin sprint out from between two buildings, metal shining in his mouth and on his hip. His twin cousins followed, the three of them gesturing wildly, drawing the armed men's attention. When we reached the jaunt, Ma Violet lurched to the top step, collapsing into an empty front seat. I slid in beneath the steering column where, by grace, keys dangled. Inside, a group of neighbors huddled along the brief aisle, their voices flowing toward us in recognition. A hush fell when Knox crested the landing behind me. My college boyfriend, tall and white, wearing wire-rimmed glasses. My eyes hung on him too for a fraction of a moment, with me wondering rashly, why is it we love what we love? Those men with guns must have seen our shadows in the jaunt bus window. A burst like fireworks, a jagged brightness, then I heard a known voice shouting, "Go, go, go." It was Devin's voice. He and the twins had shot back at the men as they made their way to us. They jumped onto the bus, and I stomped on the gas, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my palms ached for days. We did not so much peel off of First Street as fly away. That was the night we came and claimed this place, if not first exactly, then first since this dark new unraveling, when everything's been set free again, the way I see it. Not to mention our original due, denied, dismissed, but still there teeming in our blood, at least in my Violet's and in mine. So I'm going to end there. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you again for highlighting our books tonight.
Thank you, and congratulations again to you. Does anyone have any questions for either of our authors? Joe's going to moderate a Q&A section if we have questions.
Yes, if anyone has any questions, don't forget, feel free to drop it in the Q&A, or you can type it in the chat and we can check that out there as well for you all. But Mia, quickly, just to start us off while folks are typing, in researching your book, and we're all taught about the Green Book, and folks are well aware of that, but were there any facts or anything that you found that kind of maybe took you by surprise, or that were unexpected in your research?
Yes, I felt like I had a big surprise each chapter, things that I just didn't expect. I was surprised to find out, I referenced them briefly, what Black people used to actually call Jim Crow train crashes, which would be train crashes in which virtually everyone who died was in the Jim Crow car. Black newspapers used to keep these running tallies of like who died in train crashes, and I thought it was so weird, and it took me a long time to understand that there was actually this technological problem of being in an ancient wooden car on a train that was otherwise all metal, and it was something that that African Americans were aware of and protested but could never get changed. I was surprised to find out about forms of segregation on planes and in airports. I was surprised to find the central role that the war on drugs had in really making African Americans the target of police searches of cars. So there was a lot that surprised me. I mean, you kind of know things are bad, but sometimes they're worse than you think.
Yeah, like when confronted with the documentation, it had to be a quite sobering experience when you were doing that. Jocelyn, I always love to ask this question of authors when particularly they're working with short stories, which is such I think a great form. How do you approach writing a short story, and what influences did you have to take up using that particular form for this book?
So I have always been drawn to short stories. I actually think when I was very young, I went to the Young Writer Workshop at UVA when I was 16 or 17. They have this great program. It still exists. It takes place on Sweetbriar College now. And I took, this was a while ago, and I took a class on microfiction. So this idea of making every word count and having a story that maybe is the tip of the iceberg, but we can experience a whole world through it. We're going to see this little slice of it, but it's going to give us the rest of the world. And as a full-time public art school teacher, I wrote for many, many years and only stopped teaching in 2020 during the pandemic after I wrote this book. So writing short stories was accessible in a sense because I was able to draft. Short stories aren't easier, but they're different. You can draft the whole thing in a sitting. You can work in the summer and get a draft of something and then work on it over the year when you're doing all the other things that public school teachers and other teachers also do. So I think that it appealed to me. I have written novels and I've written longer things, but there's something really appealing about short stories. And one thing I absolutely love about the form of short stories is that they resist the idea of one narrative. So I have a book all about Black people living in Virginia. There's men, women, and children, and they all have a different voice. Each story has a different form. There's a story in a bulleted list form. There's a story that I read to you from that's a letter from a father to a son. There's a story that's completely in the second person. Virginia is not your home. I hung that name on you at birth, but Virginia was never your home. It's someone telling themselves the story of their life. There's My Monticello, which is a first person narrative that kind of follows the form of Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia and how he crafted that book. And then there's another more traditional third person over the shoulder story. So each story not only has a different character, but the form of the story matches or hopefully is the right shape to give you that character, their view of the world, how they carry themselves and so forth. So I really like that about short stories, that the variety that you can bring to one collection and no one can say, oh, this is what a Black woman thinks about this, because there's 3 Black women and they're entirely different in this one space. There's something about that I think can resist the idea of fiction being a neat solution or whatever. So I really like that.
Thank you so very much. So we do have a few that have come in. Donna this evening, it's not a question, but she would like to congratulate both of you for your fascinating books. And she says that she looks forward to reading them both. She said she was particularly surprised about the segregation in flights and that Langston Hughes in his nonfiction celebrated the absence of Jim Crow in his flights. And maybe that's a good way to segue a question, because I also really like the fact that we have a fiction piece as a winner this year and a nonfiction piece as a winner, and how we use both to approach history and reading and learning and often unlearning what we've been taught. And with Langston Hughes, as Donna said, he celebrated the absence of things, and it's like, how is that both in fiction and nonfiction when someone chooses to leave something out, maybe for an artistic reason, or why would they leave something out of their nonfiction if it was something that was so important and really needed to be brought to the fore? And what's it like to bring something to the fore that no one has discussed before?
Well, Langston Hughes was a great source for my book because he traveled a lot and he hated Jim Crow segregation and transportation, yet he was never discouraged by it, and it sometimes cracked him up. I mean, it's interesting that he said there was no segregation in planes because he kind of knew there was. He traveled early enough there was a time period when there were very few blacks flying, and they usually got assigned to this front seat, which today might be a first class seat, but back then when the propellers were right at the front. Nobody wanted to sit. They had this single front seat that was right near the propellers, very, very noisy, and also a lot of pyrotechnics when the propellers were fired up. And Langston Hughes knew that that was the black seat, and but he was like, "I love the view. It's great." Like he would always kind of try to make the best of some of these things. So, I mean, I think what he probably meant was flying was much better than the alternatives. But yeah, fiction is a great source for kind of understanding what's going on the ground, and also how people are responding to it. One of my favorite pieces in the book is actually an essay by Ralph Ellison, where he talks about riding the New York buses when he moves to New York, because just the experience of riding a bus where you can sit wherever you like is so new to him that he spends a couple of days just riding around on the bus when he gets to New York. And he talks about how buses in the South are kind of the worst of segregation. He calls them an inverted pyramid, where you have to kind of like go through everybody to get to this little spot you're supposed to be in, and people might kick you on the way down. And so I think fiction writers are frequently really wonderful sources, and I try to use them a lot in my historical writing. I
I don't
wonder if you use historians in your fictional writings.
usually, well, first of all, you're you talking about just that, those moments completely blows my mind because it makes so much sense. And I think often when we think of segregation in the past or Jim Crow, when I hear my parents' stories, it's always the small things and the way that this way of being filters down to the moments of all the things you do that really hit you, not the necessarily the cross burning in the yard, but just how did you access getting from one place to another? It's such a simple thing, and that lens makes perfect sense. And yet I've never heard anyone focus on it just unto itself. So it's really quite brilliant. For me, I usually don't have to rely on history, but in this collection, I did more, especially with the Monticello piece. Often I'm relying on, I'm writing about people who live in the time within which I live, contemporary times, so I can really know the world as they know it, and they're in the world that I know, or I can at least imagine, or it's at the edge of what I know, or it's a story, a family story that I've heard. But in this piece, I had to think about Monticello. I had to think about the history of Monticello. I wanted to be mindful of the factual pieces in the story, even though it's set in the near future. I definitely wanted the things that I stated about the history of the place to be as factual as possible. And so I did read a little bit. I did, as I said, read, even just reading Thomas Jefferson. I probably wouldn't have read that book, and it was really interesting. And that book is in the story, right? And so the fun part about it, and the thing that I did to hide my own bad historian, my not very good historical chops, was to write a story where the character, I only had to understand what these characters understood about Monticello. I didn't have to understand what it would be like to live in Monticello in the time of Sally Hemings. I had to understand what it would be like for a young Black college student to live there a few years in the future. And so I knew it as a tourist, and I knew it as having gone there, to take family or a guest or on a school trip, and all the ways that Denasia Love, the character, knows it. I could go there, and it made visiting Monticello a lot more fun. And I felt like I had a little secret. I had my notebook, and I was like, you all don't know, you all don't know what I'm doing here. And it made looking at each object have this new resonance, because one of the things I realized while writing this collection is I was born and bred in Virginia. Virginia is my home, and yet there's these ways in which it doesn't feel like my home. There's these ways in which, as a Black woman, in small ways, not like at the top front of mind, but just like, is this mine? How is it mine? Where am I careful around it or reticent around it? And for me, August, the Unite the Right rally brought that kind of to top of mind, because there were literally people basically being like, you should not feel as home here, kind of chanting that in a half a mile from my home. So So I thought about a character who, if not a descendant of Thomas Jefferson, founding father, person who designed and made Monticello possible, and the Hemings family, Black enslaved people who, and all the other enslaved families that lived there, who made it possible for him to have the wealth and the resources and to have the comfort and the time and all the things to do the thing, and who literally built, the arches, the beautiful chairs, the things. If not a descendant of both those people, if she doesn't feel at home there, who should? Who should feel more at home there than this character? And yet she doesn't. And that, I think, is an experience a lot of Brown and Black Americans might feel going to a place like Monticello. And so yeah, that was a very circuitous answer, but I did think about history, but I thought about it in this very of the moment way. And it really made me recognize and think about how much history shapes the very small moments of what we have now, why roads are where they are, why we travel the way we do, why we feel comfortable. All these things have a history to them, and they're just often unseen.
Thank you so much. Well, as we get to the top of the hour and get ready to close out, what's next for the both of you? What are you working on? Or, maybe, what are you working on in the spare moments that you have as normal life, as normal as it gets nowadays, is sort of coming back around?
Well, ironically enough, I'm working on a book about Black ideas about Thomas Jefferson.
Wow,
Which
okay.
is one of the many reasons I read your book. It's something I started a long time ago. It was initially just supposed to be an article, and it just sort of been picking away at it over the years. Because I started out my career as someone who looked at 19th century Black thinkers and read a lot of pre-Civil War Black newspapers, and they actually talk about Jefferson a fair amount. And for all that, there's been an enormous amount of books published on Jefferson, there really isn't a lot on what he sort of meant to African American writers and thinkers, especially in this pre-Civil War time period when he was referenced a lot, both critically and positively by Black writers in relationship to American democracy. So I've been working on that, and also thinking about Virginia in certain ways. Historically speaking, my mother who died recently was from Virginia. A long family history in Virginia, most of which people deliberately forgot. So I'm sort of interested in reconstructing some of that as well.
That's fascinating. I love that connection. That's really cool. Yeah. I'm looking forward to seeing that. So I am writing another book. Well, when I sold my book, I got a 2-book deal. So my publisher always laughs because I'm like, I'm writing another book apparently, like very quickly. But I am writing another book of fiction, and I'm thinking about the ways, it's been such a kind of an insane time since 2019 when I finished this book, watching the ways that culture and social media and technology and religion can conspire to kind of bring us to what I think of as kind of some crazy places. And I wondered what would happen if those same, those are things that can change people's minds. They can compel groups of people to change, and kind of quickly. And so I was like, what if we could use those things to help solve problems I actually want to see solved? Like, what if, that fervence was directed towards us helping to solve climate change, for example? So I'm thinking about in this story about the ways in which we can respond and change and to kind of serve one another, and to kind of create community with one another, and to kind of make our home planet a livable space. So that's something I'm excited about and thinking about. And I'm also, the novella is being made into a movie. And so I'm an executive producer on that. So I'm getting to read the screenplay and thinking about that. And my teenager thinks that's cool. He's like, you wrote a book? Oh, well, it's going to be a Netflix movie. That's awesome. So that's, as you can imagine when you're 16. So yeah, so those are some things I'm working on.
Excellent. Well, thank you so very much. We greatly look forward to seeing, of course, the Netflix movie, and reading your next works. Once again, I'd like to remind you all, do check out these two fantastic works that are the Lillian Smith Book Award winners for this year at your local library or at your local independent bookstores. And as we've been saying for several years now, do support your local Black-owned businesses and independent bookstores in your communities where you can, because they are vital and important to building stronger and more diverse communities as well. Once again, thank you to Charles and all of our sponsors this evening, and thank you to you all for allowing us to come into your home and share these books and wonderful thoughts with you. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you all next year.